Thank you, everyone, for taking your seats.
I was hitting going home traffic Monday. You know, coming out of Boston traffic heading south. I got caught in that.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Lund. I am supporting some of the Northeast Ocean Planning effort. We are here with a great panel to end the day. We're going to be continuing stories from the trenches, part 2, with a focus more on planning than implementation as the last session is done. Depending on how you look at it, we have the good or bad fortune of being the last session of the day. But I think we have a solid team here to kind of keep engaging us as we get to the finish line. So we have 5 panelists. We have the fortune of having 2 that are from states and 2 that are from a regional perspective. And we have Paul, who continues to provide great insight from an international perspective, too. I was going to go up to the podium and read formal bios, but I'm not going to do that. I think the previous session's informal approach, it worked really nicely. So we're just going to continue that. In fact, when Jen asked me to facilitate today, she said, you know, it's going to be kind of Ellen DeGeneres style. So I have to admit, I was a little worried when I walked in the room and I saw aisles and rows, and I didn't want to do the dorky dance up and down. But so we're going to continue the informal approach in a different way. And we're going to start by asking the panelists to provide a brief background on themselves, but also to elaborate, as the previous panel did, some of their reflections on drivers, as well as some of their reflections on what keeps them up at night, to continue that theme a little bit. So we'll start with Jennifer from Washington.
All right. Everybody can hear me okay? So I'm Jennifer Hennessey. I'm the Senior Ocean Planner for Washington State. I'm located in our coastal program, which is at the Department of Ecology. And I just want to start off by acknowledging that I'm the lead for our effort, but only of a team of people that is really important to us. It's an interagency approach, so I have colleagues from the Department of Natural Resources and from Sea Grant, as well as representatives from our advisory council, who have all been really important to our process. So people have talked about the process. I wanted to just acknowledge that up front, that's been really important to our planning process. So what you're seeing up here behind me is a map of Washington and of our study area. It's the Pacific coast of Washington State, which is very rural compared to areas like Seattle and Tacoma, the Puget Sound region, which is heavily populated. The communities on the coast of Washington have been largely natural resource dependent over the years, including fishing and timber, as well as shellfish aquaculture is really important in this region. And it's a home to tribes. Several tribes of which have treaty rights to harvest marine resources in their usual and accustomed areas, and a national marine sanctuary. So what you're seeing there is in green, the Olympic Coast National Marine Sanctuary, the 4 coastal treaty tribes here. There's also another tribal reservation down here, and then most of the population cities are on the south coast. So we were asked to talk about the drivers for our planning process. Back in 2007 and 2008, there were a couple proposals for marine renewable energy, including wave energy off of our coast. And they were a great example of a proponent coming in and proposing something in exactly the wrong place. Prime commercial crab fishing grounds off of Westport and Ocean Shores, and got the crab fishermen, who represent about 1/3 of the value of commercial fisheries landed off our coast, pretty excited. In addition, we had a couple years later, talk about the National Ocean Policy, and the feds are going to come in and do planning. And that was the perception of a lot of our stakeholders, is they're going to come in and we got to get our state interests in alignment and tell the feds, have a process to tell the feds what our interests are. And so our state legislature passed a law in 2010 providing a framework for marine spatial planning, and in 2012 followed that up with resources to do our planning process. So those are some of the drivers that led us to our planning process and set up the framework. And where we are now is entering the stage of wrapping up data collection and data analysis and moving towards drafting recommendations for the plan. So we've come a long ways, but we still have a long ways to go. And I think what keeps us up at night is trying to keep the process going and keep people engaged and working well together. Dave is laughing, Flority. He can add more from the peanut gallery. But I think hoping that people will continue to work together proactively, and that these individual interests and positions won't come colliding at the end and have everything fall apart. So that's maybe our fear, worst case scenario. So that's our coast, and those are the drivers and some of our fears. I think given the implementation panel, we'll talk a little bit about that moving forward, but certainly looking forward to trying to figure out how do we do adaptive management, how do we implement this plan moving forward, how do we have the resources to take those data gaps that we know will be there and act on them, and just keep the focus on learning more about this important area and how to manage it better. So with that, I will pass it on to
Yeah,
Dennis.
thanks.
Yeah.
All right, great to be here, and thanks for you all coming back inside. I don't know that I would have if I weren't sitting here. Just kidding. Jen is not, oh, you are here, okay. Betsy Nicholson with NOAA's Office for Coastal Management. I'm the North Regional Director of our office, so it covers Great Lakes, Maine to Virginia. And I have the privilege of being the federal co-lead for the Northeast Regional Planning Body. So I'm here talking on behalf of many folks on that regional effort, including my state co-lead, Grover Fugate. Thank goodness. Okay, so in terms of drivers, there's an obvious top-down driver. That is the National Ocean Policy. In 2010, Obama signed, yay, Beth Curtula's here too, yay. So that's a very clear driver. It's a directive to the federal agencies to create regional ocean plans. And we, along with the Mid-Atlantic, have a deadline of 2016 to get our plans done. So, and that's a good thing, Beth. That's a good thing, because deadlines actually keep the momentum going, and you have a light at the end of the tunnel. So the top-down driver is National Ocean Policy. The bottom-up driver is much more pragmatic than that. I think, we have sort of the perfect storm, or that's a bad analogy, the perfect recipe for sort of moving ahead as a region in the Northeast, and that is that we have a requirement, an executive order. We have state plans in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and seasoned state leaders to build upon. We have ready-made relationships, largely through our Northeast Regional Ocean Council, NROC, that was started 10 years ago, well before this executive order was signed, where we already had really important relationships, at least between the states and the feds. We had a little bit of fairy dust, some funding from NOAA and the Moore Foundation specifically, and we have emerging uses we're trying to react to, like everybody else. And we've been very clear in this planning process to call out 3 that we want to make sure that we have some time to discuss, and that is offshore renewable energy, offshore aquaculture, and sand and gravel management. So we're trying to use this as an opportunity to tackle a few things that are right in front of us. Let's see, where are we now? Okay, so we convened to begin with in 2012, the first regional ocean planning body to form, and it's for all the reasons I just mentioned. No magic to that. And we're almost there. We've got about 5 months to finish writing this, and I know that everyone says the process is the most important part, but we need a product too. A lot of people have worked many years on this, and the appetite is dwindling, and we need to finish this so we can test drive it. So we are I would say, sort of in the trenches for sure, but we have a very specific timeline we're trying to meet. So look at Katie here. Let's see, what keeps me up at night? besides my 2 children, let's see. One of the things is the fact that, the states, here they are, a few of them just having finished their plans, and we're pulling them into a regional process. I mean, I don't know how you all sleep. But if you're not doing your own plan or revising your own plan, now you're involved in a regional plan that will need to be, So that's asking a lot of our state partners, and I realize that, and I'm very appreciative of the time they're spending with us as we learn as we go. The other thing that keeps me up at night is accountability, enforceability, and sustainability of this plan. So as was mentioned many times today, there's you got to think about the implementation while you're doing the planning. And accountability, even though there's an executive order, we're going into a change of administration. We got to make sure that career, feds and state folks, and of course tribes and Fishery Management Council, everybody believes in this, believes that they can benefit from this, and it becomes common practice because it's practical and it makes sense. That's what's going to survive. Enforceability, I have no idea. Sustainability, and it's got to come with some hard commitments from the feds and some cash as well to maintain, information products that we're hanging our hat on here in terms of committing to using. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Betsy. Bob will hear from another regional perspective.
Right, right.
Bob wears the hat of being a member of the regional planning body in the Northeast, but here today in the role of the federal co-lead for the Mid-Atlantic.
Right,
So.
and I work for BOEM. I've worked for them a long time, and I got the perspective of a regulator and what it takes to write environmental documents and permits and other things that lend themselves to realizing we can do better and all of those types of things, and this is a great way to do that. So in terms of the drivers, and I'm speaking now for the Mid-Atlantic, I think, not just my own perspective, I think certainly new uses, especially offshore wind with this, the Secretary's Smart from the Start program, which established, working through individual states, established some wind energy areas offshore, and they are up there in the Mid-Atlantic, and that's also, of course, our region down to North Carolina. So new uses in the area, plus existing concerns on multiple use, the desires to protect ocean resources and also have successful ocean uses as well. And, as this came into being, the RPB, the large issues that are so tough to tackle are certainly playing more of a role, like what do we do about climate change in terms of coastal resilience, ocean acidification, and there's a desire by many to use EBM as a way to sort of address these really tough, large issues. So lots of drivers. In terms of status, where we are, the Mid-Atlantic Regional RPB is made up of 8 federal agencies, 6 states, and 3 tribes. We've had 4 meetings to date. We've got 2 more planned for next year. We've developed our framework, our charter, et cetera, and spent a lot of time working on what our outline would be for the actual Ocean Action Plan, the OAP. And at this point, I want to give a shout out to the many facilitators that have helped us through this process. The groups that come in and run these types of meetings, you all know how valuable that is. And they've done a fantastic job of not just running things smoothly, but they got a hell of a lot of brain power. And I'm not going to mention them because I'll forget some, but the facilitators are doing a great job, and they really help us as we move closer to implementation to keep the communication going and structure our work going forward. We're at the stage now where we've broken a lot of the remaining work into 3 working groups, and we're getting ready to put pen to paper on actually writing the commitments that the entities in the RPB are going to agree to going forward. So we have what we call issue champions, and since this is a ground-up process, the way it developed is We did a lot of soul searching with help from folks like Dear and Blatt, who went around and visited a lot of the agencies and talked to the people that do the actual work. And we had an awful lot of potential ideas to look at that the states and tribes put forward, as well as some of the federal agencies. And then out of that long list of potential things, we used our ground-up process and someone willing to step up and champion it as the way to say, okay, this is what we're going to work on. There's lots of other stuff that will be hopefully approached later in the plan, but for the first iteration, we've got a series of issues that we are going to work on. We're just getting that underway, although we don't really have that much time to get it together so that we can get it to Beth at the NOC in mid-September next year. And I have to mention the major role that Marco plays in terms of the great work they're doing on the data portal and in concert with the RPB going forward, the stakeholder liaison help they do, and the tribal listening sessions. So really good, strong partner there, and we're now getting ready to actually do something as opposed to plan something. And so in terms of what keeps me up at night, I don't really have that, but I do have stuff that I wish I was asleep for. And you know, one of those things is the planning to plan mentality that you can really fall into that easily, especially as this was all getting underway. Endless discussions about planning to plan, as opposed to planning to implement, which I think we are now doing. There was a lot of navel gazing about, gee, you know, what's the best way to do this? And I think it depended on how well read you were in the MSP literature as to whether you heard good ideas in some of those discussions. A lot of it was just sort of fretting, to be frank. And I think, looking back, I think it was more like folks getting used to each other and working from different perspectives and trying to get their hands around, what is this thing we're doing? What are we trying to do? You know, it's something new for us, at least. So anyways, the last panel we just had here showed that good implementation is possible, so it can be done, and it has been done. And I really think the agencies involved now need to take a leap of faith to actually translate the good ideas coming out of the planning ideas into action that someone will take to make the things come into reality. So it is sort of a leap of faith to go champion something in your agency and say, look, I really think this is going to work, it's going to benefit you, such and such. And hopefully the people that actually do the work eventually become the champions as well. So, so I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Paul, you are obviously a part of the morning session, and I was thinking that if you do get invited back for the next symposium, if there will be another symposium, we'll have a T-shirt that says, what keeps you up at night? Because that phrase that you've brought to today's symposium has been said so many times. But now you can elaborate yourself a little bit on that question.
Yes, I will in a bit, Jen, because I'm wondering whether I should disown the phrase now. But anyway, but I will come to that, and I've got some words for Paul Claring as well on that. So yes, I am, as you heard earlier, the head of marine planning in England. Here I'm known as the guy who came up with the phrase, what keeps me up at night. Good we have a map. So we were asked to talk about drivers. I don't want to blind you, Bob, so I get this right. I think it's fair to say the catalyst for getting marine planning on the statute book was probably the arrival of offshore wind. But there'd been about 8 or 9 years of advocacy for what became known as marine planning. We actually called it sea use planning in the early days in the UK. And a lot of different groups actually saw something in it for them. So certain industries like aggregates, I think agri-industry, you use that phrase here, were looking for greater certainty. Some industries were wanting to see a bit more thinking about the future. Environmental interests wanted to see environmental issues dealt with more proactively and perhaps look at bigger issues like cumulative effects. There was also a lot of talk of what was called the democratic deficit, where local communities and their representatives on the coast not only felt disconnected from, but disenfranchised from decision-making that was going on in the marine area, which was largely undertaken by central government bodies. And so all of these different groups saw something in what became known as marine spatial planning, which is great because it meant there was a lot of support, a very broad range of support. The downside is that means there's a heck of a lot of different expectations on what the process and the plans will deliver. By the way, Betsy, I don't think anyone says rarely that the process is more important than the product, just as important.
Okay.
So all of that led to white paper, and then finally a bill, and then finally the Act of Parliament that governs what we do at the end of 2009. The MMO was brought into being because of that act. So for David, there's an example, because we were too far behind for you to include in our review, but an example where a new institution was created because of this, and I can elaborate later about why. 2011, the Marine Policy Statement I alluded to earlier, and then we got going. And the fun bit for us in England is we have lots of areas to produce plans for. There are actually technically 11, although we tend to call that one. We're doing them 2 at a time, and not surprisingly, the inshore and offshore areas, which are defined because of other issues in the Act that had to do that, we've been doing or thinking about doing them as couplets, because who wants to produce an inshore plan here and then later do the offshore? It doesn't make sense. The first plans were here, and we're working here. And this thing here is actually a marine information system which takes our first plan, the information that lies behind it, but also most importantly, the information that is in the plan itself, whether it be straightforward spatial data, whether it be the area to which particular policies apply. And it's a dynamic system that you can interrogate all of this stuff. So it essentially is a digital representation of the plan. But one that you can overlay layers, so you say, I'm a developer who wants to do something here, I pick my area, and I can interrogate it in the way that I want. And actually, we want to invest much more in this, to the point where maybe one day we don't have paper plans, we just have this thing, which is much more usable, and it makes it much easier to kind of bite at the plan, rather than going, here's 200 pages, wade through that. We were asked to comment on progress. As I said, we produced the first plans here. Interestingly, we have a call-in procedure for the plans, but it was felt not needed for these first plans. It was felt that we'd done enough of a job in involving stakeholders. We will see whether that applies to the ones we're working on now. And what we're in the middle of thinking about at the moment is how do we deliver the rest of these, given actually we've got to do it by March 2021. And there's various options for playing catch-up, because we are going to play catch-up. We're actually, in the next couple of weeks, hopefully going to get some sort of indications of the way we go. So, what keeps me up at night? So for Paul Curran's benefit, it is partly a metaphorical phrase, rather than literal. Although, in my case, it was also literal, because I am a very bad sleeper. But I think it's safe to say, compared to 3 years ago when I was here, I do take note of that prayer that I think David mentioned. That I just think about what I often say to my team, worry about the stuff you can control. There's a heck of a lot of stuff you can't control, and actually you just need to accept that and try and understand it, but you can't worry about it too much. That said, I am a bad sleeper. I have 2 teenage children, so that's enough to make me wake up in the night and fret about all sorts of things, which, Paul, you're right, I'm far more important. But when I do and work creeps into my mind, I think the thing that concerns me most is do people are familiar with the Hans Christian Andersen tale, The Emperor That Had No Clothes? Yeah, well, not me, but marine planning is the emperor in that situation. I worry that people go, actually, do you know what? This thing hasn't really got anything to it, after all this work and what have you. And there are different aspects to that. So it doesn't get used. People aren't patient enough to allow the time for it to show its value before they go, yeah, our judgment is we'll pull the rug on this now, thanks very much. There's not enough acceptance that the value is not just in the plan but in the process. And for sure, there's an onus on planners to actually articulate that. But if there's an audience who's not receptive to that because they're only interested in putting monetary values on a policy in the plan, then you're not really onto a winner trying to explain the process is important. So I guess that's what concerns me is all this effort, and I personally have been involved for a very long time, I've personally had the privilege to grow a team and recruit some of them, and to think that it's all been for nothing, although I have to turn around and say to them, actually, no, we're not in a job anymore. That's the kind of stuff that keeps me up at night.
Great. Thanks, Paul. David?
I'm David Blatt. I work with the Connecticut Coastal Management Program, and we are just starting our marine spatial planning effort, which is called the Blue Plan. We are the next door state to where we are here, and you may think we are small and insignificant. We're not quite as small as Rhode Island, but that's our ocean right there. It's an estuary, and it's not even the whole estuary. It's half an estuary because we share it with New York. But I would submit to you that Connecticut, little Connecticut, is second to none in at least 4 things, probably more, but those are college basketball, pizza, income inequality, and NIMBYism.
In that order?
Not in no particular order, but at least 2 of those things have to do with marine spatial planning. But nonetheless, we were able to have a bill passed in the last legislative session, which is called, again, the Blue Plan. It sets up an inventory of data and information and requires a draft plan in 4 years and the plan to be approved within 5 years. And we have not really stood up the advisory committee, so we're at the very beginning stages. But the important thing about this plan, or what's perhaps most remarkable, is that the governor decided it was his idea and it was his bill that was ultimately passed, and it passed unanimously. And in a very densely populated state with densely packed interests, how did that happen? It's particularly odd because we didn't have any of the common drivers that other states and regions have. We don't have any real offshore wind proposals. Long Island Sound is not considered a good wind area. But what we did have, one factor to which I must give credit, is all of you. All of you people working in the marine spatial planning area made MSP a thing, an idea that whose time had come, that was something that was being done. So it is sort of self-evidently a good idea if there's no particular ox being gored. And the other thing is that one of the drivers was a bi-state marine spatial planning working group, which was chaired by the Nature Conservancy and Connecticut Sea Grant, which some years ago started getting some people together to discuss having a marine spatial plan for Long Island Sound. And through several meetings and a lot of conference calls, some very useful reports were generated. And the name of this very unofficial group actually made it into the legislation. So it gave the politicians some level of comfort that there was some substance there that could be relied on. And I sort of lied about the lack of common drivers, because another thing that helped was the memory of some energy projects that were very controversial at the time, but were basically gone by 2005, 2008. These were cross Long Island Sound electrical cables, a gas pipeline, and most importantly, a proposed floating natural gas facility. That all these things generated a lot of public opposition, got people very hot and bothered, but now they all went away for various reasons. Actually, one of the electrical cables was actually built, and it's not causing any problems, but that's another story. But people's blood pressure had gone down, and we're able to take advantage of the fact that many different groups see Long Island Sound as sort of a motherhood and apple pie issue, and it's it's something that everybody believes that they're part of it anyway is very important. So they're able to come together to that extent. And lots of things keep me up at night, but what keeps me from falling asleep at my desk in the afternoon is, again, three things. The first one is the lack of resources. Another reason this bill passed unanimously is that there was no money attached to it. It didn't cost anything. It's all going to be done within available resources. And what that means is we are going to, our agency, the Coastal Management Program is within the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. So we're all taking, our commissioner is the responsible official, but he is going to need a lot of help from the unofficial bi-state working group, from Sea Grant, from the University of Connecticut, from NGOs, from the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic regional planning bodies. Much of the data we hope to use is there on the Northeast data portal. But we've got to have some public outreach. We've got to have at least a nice website, and we don't really have the in-house capacity to make a nice glitzy presentation like that. So that is going to be a chronic concern. The second concern is our friends across the pond. The extent of our cooperation with them is uncertain. We've had some differences with them over the years. Right now, the biggest difference we're having with them is involving the disposal of dredged material. And this is something that's extremely important to them, perhaps a little less important to us, but it may get in the way of cooperation on other Long Island Sound related issues. So while a lot of the proponents of MSP, particularly in the non-governmental sectors, were but also some of the legislators were hoping it could be a bi-state effort. That's written into the legislation that we will try to cooperate with New York. Whether that can happen really remains to be seen. And the third thing that keeps me awake at my desk is managing the right extent of stakeholder involvement. Because there are no imminent threats now, a lot of people are not, really excited about MSP because, they like things the way they are. Connecticut is called the land of steady habits for a reason. People like things the way they are, but they will. Their flashpoint is low in many cases, and they will erupt if they perceive a threat. But there's not a threat right now, so we have to get them engaged, but not too engaged. So I'm also worried that something will happen before the planning process is truly established, that something may happen to turn a stakeholder group against the process. And as of now, there's no indication that anything like that will happen, but you never know. It's one of those things you can't control. So I look forward to hearing lots. I've heard many helpful suggestions so far, and I look forward to hearing more.
Great. Thanks all for your perspective and background, because I think one thing that is clear after hearing you all do introductions that distinguishes yourselves as a panel from the previous one is that you're all in very different phases of the planning process. And so one of the things that I'm hopeful for is that not only can you be a resource of information for the audience who are also in planning and MSP interests, but for each other. So if you have questions for each other as we kind of talk through some of these questions, please be bouncing ideas off of each other too. And Paul, just to clarify, across the pond did not mean you in particular. It's there, we have a smaller pond here that David was referring to. Can everyone hear David okay? Because I want to make sure we have an extra mic. No? I'm going to pass, can you all pass that mic down to the end of the table?
Oh, yeah.
Just so that you two don't have to share a microphone together if we need to make sure everyone can hear you in the back. So we're going to start, I'm going to ask a couple questions like the previous panel did, and then, weave in some audience questions as well and see if you all have particular insights you're curious about. But the first one is going to link this session to the previous one's focus on implementation. And I give the team who kind of planned this event credit because they put implementation before planning. And when I saw that on the agenda, I was kind of thinking, wait, what? That's backward. But so the question, though, is, you've heard really great insights and some lessons learned from the previous panelists. Can you share how some particular things resonate with you that you heard that you can maybe bring into what you're doing now? And Jennifer,
I'll go ahead. Something that struck me at the last session was talking about data and lack of data and then data overload and how to deal with these complex sets of information. And that is certainly, I didn't bring it up in my overview, but certainly something that we're facing right now. We've compiled all this information. We're trying to do these different analyses that help guide stakeholders in providing recommendations and for us in developing recommendations, but really sorting that out and then managing it over the long term is something that's a challenge. I think we oftentimes think of this area as data poor, but as you start to compile the information, you start to see that it's really a lot of information, and how do you sort through that? And that's certainly something that our team will be grappling with in the coming months.
Mm-hmm. Bob, I see you shaking your head.
I'd like to just add that the successful implementation by the states make it much easier to sell the concept when you're first approaching folks about what we're trying to do in a regional sense, and the fact that it's been done successfully and gets pretty good reviews from a lot of folks that participated. Sort of has set it's raised the bar of what's expected now when you're doing this kind of decision making. Did you have a plan that looked at how things intersect? If you can't answer that with a straight face, you're really sort of behind the times, so to speak. So it's the successful, and certainly the fact that as we heard, you can speed up permitting in the right place at the right time. That goes a long way to show that what the value could be if it's applied in a larger sense too. So.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Making sure.
Is that better?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, as I intimated earlier, I actually, a great deal of the previous session resonated with me.
Yeah, I heard you were taking a lot of notes. So I was
indeed.
going to ask.
I mean, I may be in a privileged position in that we've both got a plan to implement, but we're still preparing and developing plans. So I'm kind of got a foot in each camp. I think something that came out, though, very strongly, Bob actually rather neatly summarized, although I'm now going to disagree with him slightly as well, but in that I think with hindsight it's easy to say, oh, there was a bit too much planning to plan going on. Actually, I think that was an absolutely necessary step, and with hindsight maybe it looked like it took too long. I don't think if you went back in the moment it would have changed. That said, I think you're right that what we need to move to, and certainly between the East plans and the South plans that we're now working on, we've moved much more to thinking about a plan for implementation. In the East, I can't remember if I described this earlier, we had a bit of a chicken and egg situation in that it was so very uncertain as to what would end up in the plan. It was a bit difficult to actually think about implementation and monitoring because we weren't quite sure what it was we were going to implement and monitor. In the South, we're in a much better position. So at every point in the last few months where we've been working on the actual plan, as opposed to steps on the way to the plan, we've done it hand in hand with how would this particular policy be implemented and how on earth would we actually monitor its effect. Not only that, and again this resonated from the earlier session, we've started the conversations with the other authorities that would be part of implementing the plan much earlier in the process. We're talking to them about preparing the plan, of course, but we've already run a series of sessions, for example, with local terrestrial authorities on we're nowhere near having a plan, but we'll probably get there, and by the way, this is what implementation would then involve. And sometimes that means you get feedback that says, oh, hang on a second, that's something quite useful to take back into the plan there. So thinking about implementation has two advantages. It may feed back into what you're actually putting into the plan, but it also means that as you get towards having the plan adopted, you're ready to hit the ground with implementation. And we've heard it said quite a lot here. I use another phrase. Getting the plan published is not the beginning of the end. It's the end of the beginning. And I think if I could convey a key lesson that we've learned from our first exercise to a second exercise, it's getting implementation and the monitoring and evaluation that will flow from it into your mindset, hand in hand with actually preparing the plan.
So given the fact that you're involved in kind of multiple plans and some are evolving after you've done planning in other areas, I'm assuming that you're even learning things along the way that's modifying your process, making it more streamlined or more efficient. Are you doing engagement in a different way?
Oh, absolutely. We devote quite a lot of attention to lessons learned. Some people prefer the expression continuous improvement. I'm not quite so keen on that, but we do that both informally along the way, but we also have pauses every so often in the process, like we did once we'd got the first draft of these plans in place. We actually had to get out of the office, go away for a day and a half, and had a very structured discussion on, so what did we do that we should do better next time? So for stakeholder engagement, for example, in the East Coast, it's actually quite patchy whether you have established coastal partnerships, but tend to be self-formed groups around particular issues, some of them quite mature. And it was a bit patchy whether there was a group in place or not. So because it was the first plans as well, we worked with them, but not as partners, but as stakeholders. What we decided to do in the South, where there's a bit more coverage geographically of coastal partnerships, and some of them are quite mature and quite big. So we have one for the Solent, which is a major and very busy area between the Isle of Wight and England, a lot of shipping, major port, et cetera, is that we run a lot of workshops all through the process, not just on the plan, but the evidence gathering phase, the vision and objectives phase, etc. And we actually went in as partners with them to co-run the workshops. And we had co-chairs of the workshop, so I did one with the chairman of the Solent Forum. And although that took some investment, because we had to explain how we run these workshops, and we had to ensure they were consistent so that people felt they were being dealt with fairly, it meant that somebody who was a local face or a local group, who get these people together all the time anyway, was in on these workshops with these strange people that had wandered down from wherever we're based to come and talk about that area. And that's something definitely that we've learned that we would then carry on through into the rest of the plan areas.
Thanks.
One more really quick
Yeah.
thought, just something that struck me from the last panel. Bruce, who I totally, is he still here? No, I think he left. I always thought he knew what he was doing, but he admitted he didn't. So that made me feel better, kind of.
I think his phrase
but
was, we're just figuring out
as
out
we go. And
Yeah.
it's total fly by the seat of your pants.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't tell you how many graduate courses people are taking on how to do this stuff, how many people are writing dissertations in real time on what we're doing. It's terrifying. And, you know, I think there's just a realism that needs to hit us all as we're entrenched in the planning phase, that this is totally an evolution. We are figuring this out, and that's okay. And, you know, there's a lot of people that have been waiting for this kind of opportunity to happen at a regional scale, though. So there's a lot of pressure to do it perfectly and do it all the first time. And that's not going to happen, and that bleeds into sort of managing expectations and those sorts of things. But, you know, I think when I look forward to implementation, I look forward to something that's actually manageable. More manageable, I think, than the planning process has been in terms of just, you know, understanding, I think as Grover said, who wants to continue to be engaged. There are some really important issue-based or user-based groups that have formed as a result of our process or that already exist that we know now that that's where to go. And then there are people that didn't show up at all that we know are still a gap. But I think you can just, as you go from planning into implementation, be a little bit more realistic about the approach, make it manageable, and don't be afraid of epic failures, although I don't think the first iteration of a plan would be an epic failure, but don't be afraid to stumble, because there's time to figure it out. Hopefully there's enough appetite as we go into implementation and momentum so that we can continue to work on this at all scales. And we've heard about all scales here today, but it gave me a little bit more faith.
Those are good points, for sure. Betsy, I'm kind of, since I've been working closely with you over the past couple of years, I guess I'll direct the next question to you, but also David, or I hope it has a little bit of benefit because you're so early in the planning process. But the question is, now that you're in the plan development phase, looking back even a couple years, what would you do differently in the groundwork that was set, or even the pre-planning that was done? Do you have any insights that you could help David with?
Yeah,
As he's
Bob, I'd love you to
embarking.
chime in on this too.
Yeah.
This was like, in preparing for this, is the question I had the most trouble with. To look back, I wonder if there was a way, if there was something different we could have done to better sustain the involvement of tribes. That's something that, as we near the final year, we've just lost a lot of them. We started with 10, and maybe like 2 or 3 attend every meeting now. That's a problem. Did we do something wrong? Was there something we could have done differently in terms of, and you, Katie, have been really instrumental in keeping those folks at the table. But I wonder whether we had very strong participation from the beginning when we were talking about our vision, talking about values, sector by sector, putting it all together into goals and framework. They had an amazing stamina for that process, where the rest of us it was painful, right?
Yeah.
But that's a really important part of the process. But I wonder if there are elements of this where their values are, I know they're sustained, but there are other elements that are just plain federal issues or regulatory issues or things that are just not as relevant to them. And that I think has caused us to lose a few of them, and obviously they're busy people as well. But that's one thing that I wonder if we could have done something differently.
And Jennifer, do you have any other insight? Because in your introduction and your bio information, you talk about your experience with tribes on the West Coast quite a bit. I don't know if you have any ways that you can help answer some of those concerns.
I think it's challenging. Tribal capacity is limited. And we've acknowledged that in our process. We've actually provided support to the tribes to be at the table, to travel to meetings.
We did too.
And to provide different products. And so that did help, but it's still, they're busy people, and there was a lawsuit among the tribes during the middle of our process. And so
And you have
that,
like 200 on the West Coast.
well, on the West Coast, yeah, and in our planning area, luckily it's the 4 treaty tribes and then the other tribe that's on a reservation. So it is a much smaller scope for our planning process in terms of we know those people, and but it's challenging. And I think one thing that somebody said earlier, that you kind of have to come to, I guess, you control the things you can control, right? So you offer those opportunities, you make sure they're aware, you make sure that they're, they have that opportunity, and if they choose to pass it up, you kind of have to let it go to a certain degree. But you don't stop trying to make sure that they're at least, you're communicating with them and that they have the opportunity to be part of the process. You can't make them come to the table, so, yeah.
Bob, do you have other thoughts other than the
Yeah, I
tribal?
think I would certainly echo the comments about the tribal members. We have 3 now, which is 2 more than we had when we first started, so that's great. But I wanted to touch on something else, and that's if I could go back in time, and it has to do with setting expectations of what could come out of this effort. And I think the entities that are non-federal in the RPB, unless you live in a federal bureaucracy, you don't really have a feel for what's possible and what isn't. And I think we get far too much credit for being more powerful than we really are in terms of getting resources or changing the way we work. And so if I was going to start the whole thing over again, I would take a couple of days in a meeting like this and just sort of go over agency by agency. This is the stuff we have to do, but not in terms of, like a boring presentation, but, here's the challenges that we face. We have a law that says when a permit comes in, you have 30 days to respond. So you get some of those constraints on the table, and then the commitment to do some more work and make it better means more. So I think, right now, the way the RPB meetings work, it's kind of formal. It's not as bad as a FACA meeting with the court reporter, but you're in a big room. There's not, and people who come to these meetings all the time know this. You don't get this kind of dialogue unless you have a stakeholder meeting beforehand, which we just did, which was great. And if I could design it a better way, I'd have a lot more of the stakeholder type meetings and less formal RPB meetings, because you're only together for a short time, and it's crucial that everybody sort of understand where the other person's coming from in terms of what they can and can't do.
Right.
So.
David, I know you're in the midst of setting up your advisory council right now, so some of this is probably relevant in terms of the formality versus the informality of what you're doing in Connecticut.
Well, who gets to be on, what types of stakeholders get to be on the committee is specified. So,
can you hear him back? I want to make sure it's not fit.
the types of stakeholder groups that are represented in our advisory committee is specified by statute. So that's something we have to work with. And in some cases, the right person was obvious, but in other cases, the right person was not obvious. And in a small state like Connecticut, the personal relationships and who you have representing the stakeholder groups can make a big difference. So how the interpersonal dynamics of the advisory committee will work out will have a big effect.
So, Paul, do you have thoughts on this one before we?
Well, if we're all sort of going into the confessional about things that...
Please confess.
I'm going to stand up, actually, because I've got this, and it'll help my energy levels, and maybe the energy levels in the room, because everyone is doing well, but whenever you're there, folks, just keep the concentration going a bit longer. So there are some things that, it's not so much I wish we'd done them differently, but we don't need to do them again. So setting up some of the stakeholder structures, setting up some of the information stuff, developing the methodologies to how to do impact assessment, that sort of stuff. We don't, we can just roll it out. Things that perhaps we could have learnt earlier. I talked about goals this morning, and we have this national policy document with goals in it. And what we did in the South, as we did in the East, is we went through quite a process of trying to find some goals before we got to objectives. We decided we should just cut that out, because all we're really doing is taking those national goals and re-expressing them in a South Coast way. But you end up sort of saying the same stuff. The reason we did it is because in the East, we actually paid a lot of attention to working with stakeholders on what kind of objectives do you even want. Do you want them cross-cutting? Do you want them sectoral? Do you want them smart or not? By the way, as an aside, Bud Euler's project, which I have to declare a hand in because I was involved in the advisory committee behind it, it does paint the ideal, but it does say that, and it says pick and choose what will work for you. But I have had discussions with him. I said, it's great to aim for smart objectives, but you show me any plan in the world that's actually fully populated with smart objectives. But does planning not get done? No, people get on with it. So there's an example of, it's good, but maybe not perfect. But that's something we would change differently. Interestingly, I have a slight converse experience to Bob, so this is now going to possibly provide confused advice, is that we do a lot of stakeholder engagement, a lot of stakeholder workshops, and perhaps we will carry those on. But what we probably didn't pay quite enough attention to is the more formal structures for working across UK government departments. Because what we come to realise is this is a new deal for individual departments. To go through, and it's right to use the phrase, this paradigm shift of thinking about the sector that I happen to manage, whether it's ports or energy or aggregates, to, I've got to think about all the other people as well and what the other government parts do. You can't underestimate how much of a shift that is. And what we realized is that we were dealing with government departments often on a bilateral way, and we're a pretty small agency sat under one government department. And looking back, and we did kind of suggest it, but there was no appetite at the time, we probably needed some sort of more formal governance structure that allowed that conversation across different government departments to happen. And that's certainly something that we're looking to set up if we carry on doing plans in the way we have. And the final thing I would talk about, because we have asked about this, is research. Should I mention that now, or are we going to deal with that later?
There is, we'll get into research.
Okay,
I'll
I'll sit down.
Because I would love to transition to kind of some questions from the audience on this topic, because I'm sensitive to the fact that a lot of the things that we're talking about that are looking backward in the process have involved you in many instances. And so if you all want to work off of this kind of general theme right now, feel free, or if you just have a general question, we can mix it up a little bit with some of the audience questions. Yeah, Dan.
Hi, David, I'd like to ask you a question about Connecticut. When you talked about forming your stakeholders, it strikes me that there's a couple of things that are unique about your marine spatial area that you didn't mention. Number one, I think you have what's still known as the world's largest submarine base, in which the clients like to come in underwater in that marine space. And secondly, your coastal zone is defined, I think the only state in the Union can say this, is defined by a railroad line. It's the only state that has a railroad line that's running through wetlands, on pilings, over bridges, and this must have, so Amtrak and all its various related parties must be some sort of a super stakeholder for you as you contemplate making any kind of a change. Could you comment on both those clients or stakeholders?
Well, in terms of our first stakeholder, they have nuclear weapons. So we're very solicitous of their needs. And actually, we do have a good working relationship with the Navy. And I think they're one of the things that has struck me about CMSP is, especially in Connecticut, is that stakeholders often do not respect the needs of other stakeholders. They're more about, how is this going to affect me? But people do respect the Navy and their needs. So there is an acknowledgement that the submarines have to go in and out, and you should not put anything anywhere that's going to get in their way. As to Amtrak, I guess the easy answer is the Blue Plan looks offshore. It's not coastal. There's even a very awkwardly worded definition in the statute that says, for purposes of spatial planning, you start at the 10-foot contour and go out. So the idea was not to duplicate the sort of inshore, onshore coastal management programs that already exist at the state and local level. So I am a little worried about Amtrak's pie in the sky notion of running a railroad bridge from Long Island to New London or wherever it is. That's one of their long-term plan options. But we'll deal with that when it arises, if it arises.
So you might not want to publish your railroad map yet. Wait a couple years. David, I saw you had a question over here as well.
Yeah, I have a question for Betsy in regards to your comments about the tribes being given an opportunity to be involved in the process. One of the things that we've observed from tribes and individuals from tribes is that opportunity is one thing, capacity to take advantage of that opportunity is another thing altogether. And I'm curious as to whether or not that was a discussion that was had early on as you were engaging the tribes as to what the capacities were of the tribes to be involved.
No, it's a really valid question.
Let's repeat the question, because I don't know if the question that David asked was there an effort early on in the process to get a sense of the capacity of the tribal effort and what they were able to even bring to the table early on in the process? Is that what you were asking?
Well, yeah, because there's a significant difference between the capacity to be
Right.
able to take advantage of an opportunity
Yeah, so I'll start, and Katie, you can pick up.
Am I supposed to answer?
So, I mean, there was, so tribes are full partners around that table, which is great. And they expressed a lot of enthusiasm, especially toward the beginning, to be involved in planning and recognizing that it's outside of the consultation process and that this would help identify opportunities to even be better, to better engage, across all sectors around their interests. We didn't really do a capacity assessment, if that's what you're asking. We did, have individual conversations with tribes. We had tribes that quite frankly, like the Penobscot, I think, that said, we can't handle it. We're not going to play. Thank you for asking, but we can't handle this extra forum given our workload. And then the tribal members that signed our charter and that have been involved. Some are tribal members themselves, and others are hired environmental consultants, so that also differs. I think we've had some, we've had sort of equal, I wouldn't draw a distinction between who participates more there. I mean, perhaps the consultant, but that she's just as committed to tribal values as the tribal members. So, Katie, do you have anything to add? Because you've been really our tribal liaison.
Well,
done a lot of work on the ground.
I mean, I'll offer a couple insights. Early on in the process, I think when the planning process got underway, it was kind of because of NROC and the federal and state partnership and so many of the activities that were already underway. I think that one of the things that was clear is that there were different levels of not just capacity, but knowledge of what the process was and what it involved and what it meant. And so that just happened very early on. There were different levels of engagement based on who was already around the table and working together in some ways. And the tribes weren't as much because of NROC being that federal-state partnership. But with that said, I think because of the lack of capacity, there was just an acknowledgement that you have to use existing networks, existing communication forums, like the coordination that already exists through EPA with tribes. So in part, what we've been trying to do is target instances where they are already communicating instead of bringing new opportunities and expecting them to be able to come to the table, or to have specific projects and focuses. Chucky Green's involvement, I think, most recently in the ecosystem-based management work group. If there are specific focuses and topics, it tends to be able to use their capacity in a much more targeted way. So that's just what I'll add. But, we can continue with a couple more audience questions for sure.
It seems to me that, at least on what I'm familiar with, is Northeast and Mid-Atlantic and East Coast United States planning projects. And it seems to me that they're boiled down, and from what we just said today, just in this group, is that they seem to be boiling down to these federal and state permitting decisions and making those decisions, that decision-making process more faster and easier to do, more effective. But in my mind, I may have been naive or whatever, but I first read the National Ocean Policy, and that's not what it was about to me in my reading. It was more about ocean health, about societal choices, not just federal agency choices made by, are we going to permit this project or not permit this project, but a societal choice. What we have a project, aquaculture project, for example, is that what a direction we want to take in this region, to do this type of aquaculture or this type of industrialization of the ocean through wind energy, or do we want to engage in ocean mining, for instance, sand mining, or whatever. These are tough decisions, and they're decisions that we want to make as members of society members of different stakeholder groups. We want to help these planning bodies make. And it goes beyond, in my mind, it goes beyond those permitting projects. How can we get to a point when we can help make these decisions, these important decisions for our ocean out there now? And the second part of that, when I come to these meetings, these faces are getting very familiar. A lot. Not necessarily today, because we have a more international, more national crowd here. But in the Northeast, we have very familiar people that come to us. There's a finite group of people who are involved. So why can't we engage these people in a stakeholder process? And it seems like we fail to fully engage. In this day and age, this is a finite number of people. We ought to be able, in this day and age, we ought to be able to deal with this many people and engage them in this process.
So, Richard, I heard two questions, and I want to make sure that we capture them, and I help our panelists kind of focus. But, so the first question was the planning process, how does it become more than just about permitting of projects? And I think...
How do we get back to the national ocean policy, ocean health decisions and societal decisions based on sound science?
Yep. So that's beyond just the RPB. I think any of you can help answer that. And the second was diversification of engagement activities or efforts. I think that's probably a challenge, again, not just for the regional planning body process, but just in general, engaging the public in the topic of marine spatial planning when it's a slightly abstract topic until you actually have some there is what we sometimes say. So let's try and focus on those two, and then I'll see if someone else has one. Go ahead.
Me?
Sure.
Okay.
Why don't you go first,
So
Bob?
from the Mid-Atlantic RPB perspective, it's not just about permitting. I mentioned that we have a series of interjurisdictional coordination initiatives that are currently getting underway, and one of the more important ones is on healthy oceans ecosystems. So certainly we agree with you that you know, that's key to doing anything. In fact, that and sustainable ocean uses are the two guiding principles in the mid. We are working to develop so-called areas of ecological importance. That might not be the latest term, but the idea is to use the information that can be overlaid in terms of, you know, the data sets that are out there. Some of the work that Pat Halpern's doing, of course, is key to this. But eventually, the reason we're doing that work is to, and the agencies are committing to use those results in their evaluation and decision making. So you know, the intent is there to look at the bigger issues as well as one project that, you know, may or may not go forward. So which is making this really hard to do, but we're trying.
Yeah, I mean, just to pile on there, I hear you. There's a lot to do, Richard, and we really appreciate that you've been there for all of it. You know, our goals in the Northeast reflect the National Ocean Policy. Ecosystem health, effective decisions, compatible uses. There's a lot of progress to be made under all of those, but I think, you know, what we've started with is better information for more informed decisions, and something within our control, a way that we can start to use that is to develop agency guidance that commits the federal agencies to using that information in their existing management authorities. If we don't do that, we've failed. And so I get that you want to see more than that. And there are a lot of other pieces to the effort. Restoration priorities. There's a new EBM work group that just started that's grappling with how, you know, methods to figure out important ecological areas. There's ocean health indicators that we're grappling with. There are a lot of different pieces of this. Best practices for engaging all different types of folks. But man, I mean, as a Fed, if we don't get that piece right, I haven't done my job, and it's harder than it sounds to make federal agencies commit to an executive order. But really to honestly, I mean, to be able to describe in agency guidance how we're going to use this information in products in terms of making decisions in NEPA, in the Endangered Species Act, Marine Mammal Protection Act, CZMA, you name the mandate. That's where it gets real. So in this first iteration of the plan, I want to see real results, measurable things that we can say, now we have a broader context of information. We're all smarter. We have a better way of engaging folks. It's more transparent. We have more integrated information to use within our lanes, because those are the rules of an executive order. We didn't get new legislation. And so some of this is managing expectations, that is actually a big piece of this, to make sure that we have more effective decisions as a result.
You're tapping the microphone. And
Sorry, I thought I'd
That's
try the
good.
John Webber
Yeah.
method of microphone use.
I'm wondering if, go ahead.
So the questions are relevant for my situation too, and I think maybe you're right, Richard, to say you can overemphasize the benefits of the permitting system, although actually the way marine plans are to be implemented in the UK is through decision-making processes. But they're not always just for permits. Actually, you could, Port Authority deciding to put a zoning scheme in to separate recreational areas, that's a decision that affects the marine area, and the plan has something to say about that. But I think I would be slightly careful about saying it's either about the vision and the objectives for societal choices on the use of an area, although I think perhaps we can get better at that. What would we like to see come from this area in 20 years' time? There will be some choices to be made. Unfortunately, there will be some conflicts. Perhaps we can think about that and make some choices up front. But that's not either that or benefits to the permitting system. In fact, the second should flow from the first, if you get it right. Because what we're partly about is ensuring that those other interests, whether they're social, whether they're ecological, whether they're other sectors, are actually recognized and brought into the process early on, such that you preempt some of these bad decisions from happening in the first place, or even entering the system in the first place. We've just had a wind farm turned down off the south coast a couple of weeks ago, and I'm not saying planning would have made the difference, but who knows, it might have. It's been in the pipeline for years, and it got turned down on visual impacts in the end, because it led to a bit of clarification on policy in relation to some terrestrial designations. Now, if we had, through planning, articulated this is what we want in terms of our social objectives, our environmental objectives, our economic objectives in this area, and that had led to the conclusion, we're not telling you can or can't go here. We don't tend to do it that way in the UK, but we give indications. We shorten the odds, is how I would describe it. If that had led to that developer not even pursuing that site at all, net, what you will see across all those applications is a decrease in the net time spent in the permitting process, which, don't forget, if there are contentious cases, they take up the time of my colleagues, of the colleagues who are in other agencies, they take up the time of stakeholders who've got to come to the meetings and go, good God, I'm objecting to this. If you can actually reduce the number of those cases, then you do see potentially benefits in the permitting system, but they flow from the fact that you've dealt with the first thing that you referred to, which is, don't forget these plans are supposed to be visionary and they're supposed to look across sustainable development, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think of them as either or. One flows from the other.
I saw one question up in the, and then we have time for one more audience question, and you've had your hand up for a while, and I'm sorry I don't have the best eyesight, but please,
I have a question for Jennifer, trying to weave together the Northeast and the Northwest.
Yeah.
There was a question a little while ago about tribal engagement and sort of trying to continue that. And I'm wondering, in your experience with the Olympic Coast Sanctuary Advisory Council, if they've been able to maintain that or not. If I've done my homework well enough, I think you're on that council.
I am. I think you've done your homework. So just to be clear, in terms of our process, so the tribes are really dealt with not as stakeholders, as some people would term them in the Northwest. They're sovereigns, and so they get dealt with not at the advisory council, which is a bunch of stakeholders coming together to advise the state, but as governments. And so they have rights and responsibilities and authorities related to the marine environment, and so we consult with them in that way and coordinate with them in that way. So it's a separate process and separate meetings. And similarly, the sanctuary has had to deal with the same thing. They've set up an intergovernmental policy council to deal with the 4 coastal treaty tribes advising the sanctuary on management in the sanctuary. So it's the same people that we're dealing with in our state planning process. And we've used the advisory council, and both Katrina and I sit on the sanctuary advisory council as well, as a place to provide updates to those folks about the state planning process, and we coordinate really closely with the sanctuary staff on the planning process. So it's been a pretty good process. I think what you're asking is, has the sanctuary been able to maintain perhaps involvement of the tribes in their management? Is that your question, or?
Yeah, my question is pretty open-ended, because
Yeah.
I work with the sanctuary program, and I'm really asking you, does that process work? And I was prepared for you to say yes or no.
Yeah.
To me, I'm encouraged that it sounds like there are folks at the table, and they do have a way.
Yeah, yeah, and I think, you know, it's been complicated. I mentioned the lawsuit. There was a lawsuit among the tribes over their usual and accustomed areas. These are the areas in which they exercise their treaty rights, and so that has made you know, coordination among all the tribes and with the tribes more challenging, both for the sanctuary as well as for the state, and that's part of the deal. So, yeah.
So we have just a couple minutes left, right? We're ending at 4. Is that right? I would love to use the last couple minutes to ask the panelists something more forward-looking. We kind of looked backward, and something more hopeful. So, given the fact that you all have timelines, we heard 2016 for the regional planning processes, David 2019, 2021. These things are in the near future. So, can you offer all of us, as you look into the future, what some of your hopes are for the finalization and implementation of the plan? If you could pick 1 or 2 things, maybe we could. Yeah. Bob, it sounds like you're ready.
Yeah, I think an earlier panel kind of missed an opportunity to look into the future a little bit. And I know this room is full of experience and distinguished people, but the most important people in this room are the students. And God bless you if you're still here at the end of the day. And I'm not just saying that to be corny. What we're doing, I think, is we're building a foundation, and we're going to do our best to make it a good foundation, but you're going to build the house, and more importantly, you're going to live in that house. So, if you have a bug about this topic, nourish it, because if you love the ocean, this is your chance to do something to make it a better place for all of us. So.
Thanks. Jennifer, you want
I don't know if I can say anything more inspirational than that, but I think our hopes, at least in the very near term, and I think I said this at the outset, but we're hoping to wrap up our plan by the end of 2016, is that we can continue to work to get good engagement from the diverse groups we already have engagement from, and get their input on the plan development and potential recommendations, so that we can develop a plan, and I think this is building off of Becky's points, that includes practical, feasible, defensible, and implementable recommendations that have broad support. That's just, apple pie maybe.
I think I just want to finish the plan. Is that okay?
That is.
And yes, the process, the product, I get it. I just want to test drive it. I want to get on the other side of this and have a chance to see and to continue to keep the momentum and nourish it, and continue to champion it with so many other folks. But I just want to see how much of an impact we can have with this. And then what needs to be in the next iteration? And Grover's looking at me like, I'm going to be so retired by then. But I won't be, unfortunately. But I just want to get to the point where we can test drive it and have a little bit more to talk about. with the benefits. And that's why it's been so helpful to have a couple states go before, where, you know, we have all kinds of folks that are from tribes to industry and everyone in between talking about the impact it's had on them. Extremely helpful. But I want to get there. And I want this to survive into the next administration. We need to start thinking about that as well.
Great. Go ahead, David.
We've talked about whether the process or the product, the plan, is more important, and as important as those are, I'd like those both to result in a consciousness that having gone through that process to produce the product, there will be a realization that our little bit of ocean is a shared resource that belongs to everybody. We all own it, and we hold it in trust, and it's something that we need. It's not just to be parceled out for various people to use, but it's something we all need to take care of. I'm hoping that our MSP process will result in that.
Last but not least.
No, but you're holding the microphone in such a way that it seems like you want to sing, though. So if you'd like to sing your hopes and dreams, I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
One of my fears is singing in public. So, however, that would be quite a quick way to clear the room. I have three things to say. The first is practical, which is I want to be able to keep going, keep learning, delivering the next set of plans. I'm quite keen to do that, but also getting through the first cycle of the first set of plans, get reviewed, which could be quite a way away. We get evaluation, etc. A second hope is that we have people who are the sharp end, the sharp end of, my apologies, the sharp end of the decisions made in the light of the plan come out and go, this is really useful, you know. In different groups. You know, I'm looking forward to a fishing group. Do you know what? We were a bit skeptical and we thought you were a bit weird, but actually this has proved quite helpful to us. I'm looking forward to that kind of tangible evidence, because there's no point planners talking to planners saying it's lovely, because that's not going to, you know, in the end be a measure of success. And my final hope, and it partly plays into the point about students. Years ago, I was involved in the rollout of the major step change in marine protected areas in England, a European designation. And the way it worked was we helped advise government, they designated, but then the management of the sites was actually shared amongst all the authorities controlling activities in those areas. And the way it seemed to go for me was that we had, the body I worked for was the nature conservation body, and I thought there's no way nature conservation can be achieved by just one body thinking about this all the time. And so that process actually, in a sense, got lots of other authorities to just be nature conservationists a little bit and to help with the delivery of it. What I'd like to see is planning go the same way, that yes, we have dedicated marine planners and we're doing all this stuff, but over time, you want to see everyone become marine planners. Both the point that you made, David, about they recognized the shared ownership and that we're all in this together, but also that other delivery bodies, other groups, actually think in the way a marine planner thinks, and so that they're all involved in delivery it, because in the end, as much as we can go on about resources or whatever, it doesn't matter how well resourced we are. If it's only marine planners and marine planning bodies that are thinking about doing marine planning and delivering it, it's never going to actually work.
Thank you. Thank you all for your perspective, your time. Thank you all for staying engaged until 4 o'clock.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Everybody's got to stay in your seat. So I know it's early for Halloween, but we did trick you. We wrote 4 o'clock. For adjourn, it's supposed to be 4:20. So we're going to keep you here just for a little bit before getting you ready for the reception, okay? So I'm getting you ready for a fun party over on the other side of the street, okay? Are you guys with me? So this is what we're going to do. So you guys are going to go over there. You have your name tickets, right? What do you have in your little name pockets? Do you have anything?
I got a puppy.
I didn't know we had prizes.
Dog or a puppy?
What do you have? Oh, you have a drink. Okay. Oh, some people have 3, some people have 1. Okay. So, okay, so you have the drink, all right? You're all set. So now Tiffany and I are going to help you with your conversation over there, okay? So what we want to talk about, and I'm going to ask Tiffany first, okay? So you guys can roll, this is our little role model, you guys can do this over there, is Tiffany, what did you hear about today that you plan to talk about tonight at the reception?
Jen, I actually wanted to ask Paul Claren what it is that he does that makes him able to sleep so well. I mean, clearly, you got something going on there that we all need to learn from. In all seriousness,
Yes.
though, no, I heard a number of people talk about the importance of relationships. I'm sort of always surprised by that. And then a number of people also say that process is as important as the plan. So I'd like to talk more about that. If that's the case, then how do we get more resources to support aspects of planning like that, the softer pieces?
Okay, is there anyone in particular besides Paul, who's very popular, I think, that you would like to reach out to?
I would like to talk to Dave Fluharty about a comment that he made about research, sitting down as a researcher with the practitioners to work out together what are the questions that we need to work on.
Excellent, thank you.
You're
Is
welcome.
there anyone else in the room that's been thinking about who they're going to reach out to or something that they want to talk about at the reception? So Tracy Dalton, who is a professor here, who always gets to stand in the room and make the students a little nervous. What are you going? We're going to make her a little nervous here. What would you do? What are you going to go do at the reception?
First, I'm going to have a drink.
Yes, that sounds good.
Yeah, and then, and Tiffany brought up a lot of the things I've been thinking about. And for Betsy, who had mentioned that she's terrified that people are studying what they're doing. I'm one of those people who is excited that there are people doing it, so that we can study it. And study the process and learn from it. And we've been talking about these things for a long time, so I think it's interesting for me to talk to people who are engaged in the process and learn from them.
So is there anyone in particular you're going to reach out to? We had 22 people here presenting today. Is there someone in particular you'd like to reach out to?
I would say any of them.
Okay. So you might reach out to an Ed LeBlanc over here, right? So Ed, who are you going to reach out to at the reception? So do you have a free drink ticket that you're willing to give away?
I have a free ticket that's for sale.
Oh, okay, there we go. Okay, so let's imagine if you were to stay, who would you go and talk to, or what question are you?
I think I would try to promote a discussion about social capital, which Tiffany has written about.
Yeah.
And I think that there was just so many touches in the conversation that I heard this afternoon on the benefits of social capital. Panel's mom was talking about if he could, he would spend a lot more time with stakeholders. What he's talking about is developing social capital. And then in the previous panel, they were talking about the difficulty with data, say recreational boating or recreational fishing, and how much time and effort they spend to collect this data, but it's suspect data. And I can tell you that if you have good social capital developed, at least in this area, if we want to know anything about recreational boating, we go to Sales Newport. Whatever Sales Newport says, that's a fact. They know that stuff. And so we have that, I think, here in the island, which is very helpful. And actually, the plan and the process is all secondary to me. Social capital is the real value. I would try to follow that kind of conversation at the reception tonight, but I'm not going to.
Can't do that after that whole speech.
Right, I know, I think you need to stay. So, anyone else? Nathan, you haven't said anything all day. I'm surprised. What's going on in your head? Okay. There's two other people from Washington State here you could ask. Do you guys want to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Kelsey Gianni. I work with Jennifer.
I'm Katrina Laughter. I work at the State Department of Natural Resources and partner.
Go ahead, Tiffany.
So how about, let's see, Steve Olson, you have been one of our MSP Advisory Committee members and have been being very thoughtful all day. What comments might you offer to us, or what do you want to go talk about at the reception?
Well, I think that the topic of how much science do we need and when do we need it is something that really needs to be talked about a lot more. I think that I've really liked that it's come up a couple of times here that it's a science-informed process, sometimes a science-driven process. And we don't really have the language for it yet, but there's the ethical, the spiritual dimensions that keep cropping up, and they need to be woven in more overtly in how we do this work. And we need to develop the language for that. That's the kind of thing I would like to be probing with folks over the next little while.
Excellent.
Does anyone want to talk to Stephen about that? I think he has an extra drink ticket. I gave him one. Anyone want to talk to Stephen about that? No? Okay, Dave, there you go. Do you want the drink or the conversation? Quick, both. There you go, Stephen. Okay, you got it. Good.
And Stephen might also be a great person for some of the emerging practitioners that we have in the room, including the grad students, to talk with afterward. So let's try another question then. All right, so some people aren't going to the reception. Ed. Jeez. How about tomorrow? You're back in the office. What are you going to talk to your colleagues about? What did you get out of today? That's something you want to go back and talk to your boss, your supervisor, your colleague, your partner. What can you do with the information you got today?
You know, when I came in, Tiffany, I bumped into two professors or two individuals from the University of Connecticut who, these Connecticut people, I don't know if they think they have the right to cross the border over to Rhode Island. So I want to put them on the spot. What are you guys going to do? What did you get out of today, and what do you think you might incorporate into your information?
These guys right here.
Well, I talked to some folks at the Coast Guard, and I think I might have to reapproach some of my dissertation themes, but I'm on the right track, yeah. I think I'm on the right track, and hopefully I'll get a good project out of it.
I'd like to learn more about our blue plan, which I believe was the second attempt, which I didn't hear about, so I'd like to learn more about that.
So Nat, you have to come to the reception and you have to meet David, if you haven't met already. We'll make that happen.
And also a plug, Nancy Balcom from Connecticut Sea Grant is also here, who, you know, I need to say that because Sea Grant does a lot of amazing work all over the country. And Nancy, you want to raise your hand? I think they're looking for you. There you go.
All right.
Okay. Well, oh, go ahead, Richard. What are you going to do? Who are you going to seek out?
I'm not sure if someone this morning mentioned climate change as far as I'd like to know if things like climate change and ocean acidification, a lot with that, because that we found that, at least in the near shore, that we do actually can make a difference. And we're getting more into that. So how can we, as practitioners, and that's it, can we weight decisions based on climate acidification? Or how do we, is it plausible for us to direct the direction that we're taking based on things like that? How do we deal with it?
Okay. Who was that individual that talked about climate? Is that Paul? Paul, you got another, Paul's going to be drunk by the end of this afternoon. I have a feeling he's got a lot of people buying you drinks, Paul. So that would be Paul Claren. Okay, great.
In fairness to Paul, I did mention it too.
Paul said it too.
Any old Paul.
Yeah, any old Paul.
Well, interchangeable, yes.
Okay, all right. Anyone want famous last words? Any thoughts? Okay. Well, thank you all very much for participating today. We really appreciate it. This has been an amazing day of lots of interaction amongst lots of people who represent different entities, but I think we all have one thing in common. We really do care about our coasts and oceans, and so it's wonderful for you all to come, and we look forward to seeing you across the street. Thank you very much.
Yeah.